Happy Tuesday morning, everyone. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute. We are currently studying 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and the doctrine of the resurrection. We are examining Paul's form of argumentation against the scoffers at Corinth who were denying the resurrection of the dead ones. Now, it is generally, almost universally, believed, claimed, that the scoffers were denying the resurrection as a fact, as a general fact. No resurrection, period. That is simply false. Paul uses the if-then form of argumentation, as I pointed out in the last video, to illustrate and to drive the point home to those scoffers that if they denied the resurrection of the dead ones, Paul uses the Greek word nekroi, literally the dead ones, and he uses that, by the way, with the definite article. It is not simply resurrection of, quote, dead. It is the dead ones. Okay? So Paul uses some things that the scoffers firmly believed in. They believed in the resurrection of Jesus. And thus Paul argues, if you believe in the resurrection of Jesus, then you have to believe in the resurrection of the dead ones, i.e., those who died before Jesus, because he's the first fruit of those. And we'll be talking a whole lot more about the significance of the fact that Christ was the first to be raised from the dead, which proves categorically that Paul's not talking about physical resurrection. Okay, now watch this. Not only did Paul set forth the resurrection of Jesus Christ and argue, if you believe in the resurrection of Christ, then you must believe in the resurrection of the dead ones. But notice his next argument in verse 14 of 1 Corinthians 15. If Christ is not risen, and they say, Paul, we believe in the resurrection of Jesus. If Christ is not risen, which means the dead ones had to be raised, then our preaching is vain, and your faith is also vain. Well, once again, the desired response would be, Paul, you just have to stop, you have to stop the train. We've never said your preaching is an empty, vain thing, and we most assuredly do not believe that our faith is empty and vain, useless, whatever. It astounds me that modern scholars have gone so far as to say, because of their presuppositional approach to 1 Corinthians 15, they say, Paul was a horrible logician. Paul was a horrible debater. Because after all, the scoffers were denying the resurrection. Well, that would mean they would deny the resurrection of Jesus. Therefore, when Paul said, if the dead ones are not raised, then Christ is not raised, and the scoffers would have gone, Paul, that's exactly what we're saying. But Paul, that's obviously not what the scoffers were saying. And thus, now when Paul says, if Christ is not raised, then our preaching is vain. And the scoffers would have gone, Paul, we never said that. We never said that at all. And if our preaching is vain, then your faith is in vain. Paul, we never said that. And Paul said, well, really, you did? Because you are not looking at the implications of what you're saying. Now, let me ask you a question. What is the connection between the resurrection of the dead ones, the resurrection of Christ, and the vanity of the faith of the Corinthian scoffers? Well, Paul's doctrine, as we pointed out at the very beginning of this study, Paul's doctrine of the resurrection of the dead was absolutely nothing but the hope of Israel. Old covenant Israel. That hope was found in Moses, the law, and the prophets. Well, guess what? Those Old Testament prophets foretold the resurrection of Israel. Isaiah 25, verse 8, quoted by Paul, 1 Corinthians 15, 55 and 56. Hosea 13, verse 14, predicting the resurrection of Israel. Israel was dead as a corporate body, Hosea 13, 1 and 2. But God promised to raise her from the dead. What kind of death was it? It was not biological death. But Paul's doctrine of the resurrection was from Isaiah, from Hosea, from Daniel 12, from other passages. So, when Paul said, if you deny resurrection life to the dead ones, of whom Christ is the first fruit, then guess what? Christ is not raised, because Christ is the first fruit of those dead ones, and even the Old Testament prophecies made to Israel predicted Christ's resurrection out from among the dead ones. Secondly, the Old Testament prophets foretold the resurrection that you claim to be participants of. But the Old Testament predicted that resurrection to Israel first. Amos 9, 11 and following. Israel's restoration under Messiah would be Israel's resurrection. To deny Israel her part in salvation would be to say that Christ and his resurrection was unrelated to the salvation of Israel. But those promises were made to Israel. The faith of the Corinthians who were denying the resurrection of the dead ones, their faith was dependent upon the organic unity between the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to the dead ones and God's Old Covenant promises to raise Messiah from the dead. The faith of the Corinthian scoffers was absolutely 100% based upon the future to Paul fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. If they don't get their resurrection hope, your faith, Paul said to the Corinthian Gentile scoffers, your faith is in vain. Nothing there. Oh, and that's not all. And we'll pick up some more of that on the flip side. In the meantime, please do not fail to get yourself a copy of this book, Essays on the Resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 by Sam Frost. All right, we have more on Paul's argument against the scoffers in 1 Corinthians 15 on the flip side. We'll see you there.